Hey, it's Grady at Twin Creek Audio, and in this video I'm going to do something kind of unusual, maybe a little bit complicated with some analog mixers. I'm going to link two 8-channel recording mixers from the 80s together so that I can sum 16 tracks. So some of you out there may have an 8-channel mixer like the Tascam M-35 that I have or the Fostex Model 450, and you're wanting to expand that a little bit so you can sum more tracks through it in the analog domain. Or maybe you have a Tascam M-35 like I do and you can't find the M35EX expander. Well, I don't have a Tascam M35EX expander, but I have a Tascam M-35 and I have a Fostex Model 450. Both of these operate at -10 line levels and use RCA connections, so it should be pretty easy to link the two so that I could actually sum 16 tracks in the analog domain. So I'm going to go ahead and connect these two mixers together so that I have 16 channels worth of summing with some 80s vintage analog mixers. Rolling, rolling, rolling. Let's make sure the other camera is rolling because I had to have two. It's rolling. Okay. I've put two mixers side by side here on my futon in the studio, mostly because I don't have anywhere else good to put these where I can film the back of them. And this one has a lot of the connections on the top, so that necessitated a second camera up there so we can see these patch points that are on the top of this one. First of all, I need to connect the outputs of my audio interfaces. In this case, I have 16 outputs connected to this snake multi-pair cable. So 1 through 16 would need to go to the tape inputs on both of these consoles. I'm going to use the Tascam M-35 as the main console and then just cascade the buses from the Fostex 450 over to the Tascam. So I'll actually be using the outputs of the Tascam M-35 to print the final mix. The Fostex 450 will be used mainly for additional inputs so that I can sum all 16 channels from the outputs of my audio interface that are connected to the other end of this snake through these two consoles that are stacked or daisy chained together so that I can sum all the tracks through the two mixers. I'm not going to connect the outputs of the audio interface to the tape inputs yet because it's going to obscure the other things that I'm actually doing to connect these together. Since both of these mixers have RCA connections and they're both at -10 line levels, we should be good to cascade the 4 subgroups from the 450 to the subgroup inputs on the Tascam M-35. The bus outputs on the Fostex 450 are here on the top. So we're going to plug bus 1 through 4 outputs into the RCA snake. And I do it this way. I do red, orange, yellow, kind of using related colors. Red, orange, yellow, and then the next related color to that, in my mind, is green. So we're going to use those 4 from the bus outputs of the Fostex 450. Now I need to connect those bus outputs from the Fostex 450 to bus inputs on the Tascam M-35, and luckily it has a bus in on all 4 of these buses, so we just need to connect those together. Of course, this Fostex M-35 was made to have an expansion car, the M-35EX, and that would have worked perfectly with this. And we could have even joined solo over here, but I can't do that with this console, so that's kind of a trade-off, is that solo is not going to really work with this setup. However, I can solo in the box, and that'll work just fine. So now I have my 4 subgroups or buses connected from the Fostex 450 over to the bus inputs on the Tascam M-35. That means any channels that I assign on the Fostex 450 to one of the subgroups are going to be passed over to the subgroups on the M-35. So I've just linked the subgroups on these two. Now the Fostex 450 also has bus inputs because it was made to be linked like this with possibly another Fostex 450, or if they made an expansion for the 450, I'm not sure of that. But most of these 80s mixers can be linked together like this fairly easily. So now before I actually connect the audio interface outputs to all of the tape input channels on both of these little consoles, I want to use these other plugs here for something. What if I want to use an auxiliary send? Think I can use another 2 of these connections to link the aux sends from the Fostex 450 to the Tascam M-35. I'm going to choose blue and purple because I like that. Let's see, we need to go back to the 450 first and find some auxiliary outputs. So I want to link my auxiliary sends from the 450's auxiliary send outputs to auxiliary inputs of some sort on the M35. Luckily, the M35 is made for that. It actually has an input for Q and effects, which are the 2 aux sends on here. So I just need to run the aux 1 and 2 output from the Fostex Model 450 over to the expander inputs for effects and Q over here on the M35. Then I will have linked the auxiliary sends. So over here, let's see, we've got blue. We want an auxiliary out. We've got an auxiliary 2 out, and it's stereo. We don't really need a stereo output. We'll go ahead and link the left side of aux 2 out to, let's see, we want to use that for effects, sure, because it has a pre-post switch. So we'll go ahead and link that to the effects input on the Tascam M35. So now I have the auxiliary 2 output from the Fostex 450 linked to the auxiliary input. It's labeled effects over here, but it's basically an auxiliary send. And this does say expander input. So if I had an M35EX, it would have an effects output, and I could plug it in here. So now let me link the second auxiliary send from the 450. That's going to be aux 1, and it has an in and an out because, again, the 450 was made to be linked with other consoles as well. So it has an aux 1 in and an aux 1 out, just like aux 2 does here. So I'm going to use the aux 1 out, use my purple connector, and I'm going to link that to the expander input that's labeled Q on the M35. And now I've linked 2 of the aux sends. So if I send something on a channel aux send from the 450 to aux 1, it's going to actually come over here and go to the effects input, and it's going to add the aux signal coming from aux 1 over here on the Fostex 450 and inject it into the aux circuitry on the M35. So I've linked that aux send. Aux 1 is now linked to the effects send on the M35, and aux 2 from the Fostex 450 is linked to the Q send. Now it would be really useful to link the solo functions between these 2 consoles, and the M35 does have an expander solo connection right here. However, the Fostex Model 450 does not have a separate output for solo. You could use the stereo master out because the solo function over here is going to solo that track and send it to the stereo master, which I'm not using, but there's no way to signal the M35 to go into solo mode because this solo expansion here, it would have carried a signal from the M35EX expander that would tell the M35 to enter solo mode. We don't have that, but we can always solo in the box and get around that problem. Now all that's left is to connect the 16 outputs from an audio interface to the tape inputs on both of these. I'm going to use the M35 for channels 1 through 8 and then the Fostex 450 for 9 through 16. Because of the layout on the top of the console, the tape return inputs here on the back of the M35 are a little bit strange. We have 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, 7, and 4, 8. So that's a little strange, but this is 2, which is actually right here on subgroup 2 module. That's 3, and 3 is here on the bus number 3 module. Of course, these are color coded, makes it a little easier to find. That's 1 right there, which is over here, tape in 1. That's tape in 4, which of course oddly on the M35 is over here. This one's 4. This in 4 here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have 5, 6, 7, 8 on the next row. So that's 1 through 8 outputs from an audio interface connected to the tape inputs 1 through 8 on the Tascam M-35. Next, I need to connect 9 through 16 outputs from the audio interface to 1 through 8 tape inputs on the M-35. They're going to kind of double as 9 through 16. So let's patch these in now. The tape ins on the Fostex Model 450 are here on the top. And since this is an inline console instead of a split console, you have a tape input on every channel instead of like the M-35 where they're in a separate section over the subgroups. So now I've connected all 16 outputs from the audio interfaces to tape inputs on both of these recording consoles from the 80s. Now I just set all my channels to tape. There are these switches on the top of the channels, much the same as what they are on the Tascam M-35 with the mic, tape, and line switch. So just set all the main channels on both of these mixers to tape input. Now anything that I assign or send to subgroups 1 through 4 on the Fostex Model 450 is going to be injected into the 4 subgroups on the Tascam M-35. Now we have all 16 outputs of an audio interface connected to 16 tape inputs on 2 different consoles, but the consoles are linked together via the subgroups and the aux sends. The only drawback to this scenario is that the solo buttons on the Fostex Model 450 are not going to trigger the solo functions over here on the M-35, so we couldn't really link the solo function with these. You just have to work around that by soloing the tracks in the DAW, which is going to mute everything else that's going through the console, or I guess you could go through and mute everything on both of these. We'll see how this actually sounds and functions in the next video when I mix 16 tracks through these 2 vintage recording mixers from the 80s that have now been linked together. Again, I'm not demonstrating that in this video because I have these flipped around backwards so I could show the setup, and it's going to take me a little while to flip these back around and get something set up where we can actually try this. But make sure to like this video and subscribe, and check back, and I will have a video actually using this cascaded daisy-chained 80s vintage console behemoth that I've put together here. So this kind of a setup is interesting and a little bit challenging. You definitely need to understand analog signal flow and understand the signal flow in your individual mixers in order to pull something like this off. I do think it's an interesting way to go and would definitely work for you if you have the know-how to set it up and you have a couple of analog mixers that are reasonably compatible with each other as far as line levels and the inputs and outputs that they have. A lot of the 80s recording mixers are set up with things like stacking inputs so you can cascade subgroups or anything from another mixer. So it's definitely something that can work, and it's definitely a budget option, but it should sound pretty cool. Until then, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the Twin Creek Audio YouTube channel if you have not done so already. That way you don't miss the next video with the monstrosity that I've created in this video and all the other new videos here on the channel. Also, make sure to check all the links in the video description. I always put links to videos that relate to the current video that you're watching, including at the end of the video and the in-video links and all that good stuff. I appreciate everyone that watches my videos. Thank you so much to all the new subscribers here to the channel. I hope each and every one of you out there has an excellent day, night, evening, weekend, weekday, hour, minute, second, nanosecond, whatever it is you're having, have a good one. Thanks so much for watching.